May 25, 1978. Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, received a package that would change the course of American history. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with string, with the address written by hand in careful capital letters. It looked ordinary, harmless even. Security Officer Terry Marker picked it up, noting that the sender was a professor from the University of Chicago. Something felt wrong. The package was heavier than expected, and when he shook it gently, he heard a rattling sound inside. He decided to open it anyway. The explosion filled the small office with smoke and fire. Marker was thrown backward, his hands torn by shrapnel. The bomb had been primitive but effective, built with metal pipes, gunpowder, and a trigger mechanism activated when opening the box. As Marker was rushed to the hospital, investigators gathered around the scattered remains. They had no idea this was just the beginning. They had no idea they had just encountered an enemy who would torment them for nearly 2 decades. An enemy who would call himself FC. An enemy the world would know as the Unabomber. And most terrifying of all, they had absolutely no idea who he was or why he had begun this campaign of terror. Before we delve deeper into this extraordinary story, let me ask you a question. Where are you listening from tonight? Mexico City, Monterrey, Guadalajara, or perhaps from another Spanish-speaking country? Leave us your location in the comments. We love knowing how far our community reaches. And if you're new here, welcome. This channel is dedicated to exploring the most fascinating true crime stories with depth, respect, and an unfiltered look at the truth. We don't just tell stories, we dissect them, explore the minds behind the crimes and the lasting impact they left. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss a story. If you're already part of this family, thank you for your support. A like and sharing this video helps us enormously. Now, let's go back to 1978, because that first attack was just a sign of what was to come. A one-man war against modern society that would claim lives, terrorize a nation, and ultimately reveal one of the most brilliant and disturbing criminal minds in American history. The investigation into the Northwestern bombing went nowhere fast. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, no obvious clues. The package had been mailed from Chicago, but the professor's return address was fake. Whoever had built this bomb knew exactly what they were doing, and he was just warming up. Over the next 17 years, the Unabomber would send 16 bombs, killing 3 people and injuring 23 more. Each device was more sophisticated than the last, each attack more carefully planned. May 9, 1979. A bomb exploded at Northwestern University again, this time injuring a graduate student. November 15, 1979. A bomb was placed in the cargo hold of an American Airlines flight from Chicago to Washington. It began smoking at 35,000 feet, forcing an emergency landing. 12 people suffered smoke inhalation. The FBI established a task force, naming it Unabomber University and Airline Bomber. The name would stick, eventually shortening to Unabomber in the media. But what puzzled investigators was the pattern, or the apparent lack of one. The victims seemed random. University professors, airline executives, computer store owners. What connected them? Why had this invisible bomber chosen them? FBI Special Agent James Freeman spent sleepless nights studying the bomb remnants. They were masterpieces of craftsmanship, built entirely by hand, with no commercial parts that could be traced. The bomber carved his own wooden connectors, ground his own gunpowder, meticulously soldered each component. "This guy is brilliant," Freeman told his team. "He has advanced education, probably in science or engineering, and he's patient, incredibly patient." But brilliance and patience weren't enough to find him, because the Unabomber left no traces, and he was about to become even bolder. December 11, 1985. Hugh Scruton, owner of a computer store in Sacramento, California, found a strange object in the parking lot behind his store. It looked like a piece of wood with nails sticking out like construction debris. When he bent down to pick it up, the bomb detonated. The explosion shattered his chest, sending metal shrapnel tearing through his vital organs. He died instantly, becoming the Unabomber's first fatal victim. The bomber had escalated from injuries to murder. The crime scene revealed the bomber's evolution. This device was more powerful, more lethal, specifically designed to kill. It had been disguised as harmless trash, ensuring someone would try to move it. It was applied psychology, using the natural human tendency to clean up against the victim. The FBI intensified its investigation. They interviewed thousands of people. They pursued thousands of leads. They offered rewards. Nothing worked. The Unabomber remained a ghost, attacking from the shadows and then disappearing completely. For nearly 6 years, the bombs stopped. Some investigators hoped the bomber had died or been imprisoned for another crime. Others knew better. This wasn't someone who would simply stop. He was planning something bigger. And they were right, because when the Unabomber returned in 1993, he did so with a vengeance. June 20th, 1993, Dr. Charles Epstein, a renowned geneticist at the University of California, San Francisco, opened a package at his home. The explosion shattered his right hand and severely damaged his eardrum. 2 days later, Dr. David Gelernter, a computer scientist at Yale, opened a similar package. He lost several fingers and suffered permanent injuries to his eye and chest. The Unabomber had returned, and he was targeting specific objectives now. Scientists working in fields that represented technological advancement. The pattern was finally emerging. Each bomb came with the signature FC, stamped on metal components. Investigators speculated about its meaning. Freedom Club? First charge? The bomber wasn't saying, at least not yet. April 24th, 1995, Gilbert Murray, president of the California Forestry Association, opened a package in his Sacramento office. The bomb killed him instantly, making him the third fatal victim. Murray had been chosen for his work promoting the timber industry, another symbol of human domination over nature. Then, on June 24th, 1995, something extraordinary happened. The New York Times and the Washington Post received a 35,000-word manuscript from the Unabomber. It came with an offer: publish the complete manifesto, and he would stop his bombing campaign. The FBI faced an impossible decision: give a terrorist a platform for his ideology, or risk more deaths. After months of deliberation, Attorney General Janet Reno and FBI Director Louis Freeh approved publication. On September 19, 1995, the Washington Post published Industrial Society and Its Future. The world would finally hear what the Unabomber had to say. The manifesto was brilliant, disturbing, and deeply philosophical. It wasn't the rambling of a madman. It was a sophisticated, well-reasoned critique of modern technological society. The Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. It began. The central argument was simple but powerful. Technology had robbed human autonomy, reducing people to cogs in a massive machine. True freedom was impossible in a technological society. The author argued that technological advances, from airplanes to computers to genetic engineering, were not neutral. Each one reduced human freedom, created new forms of control, pushed humanity closer to complete environmental destruction. The only solution, the manifesto argued, was to completely tear down the technological industrial system. Not reform, but revolution. A return to simpler, more primitive ways of life where humans could live with real autonomy. Millions of Americans read the manifesto. Some dismissed it as a terrorist's ravings. Others found his arguments disturbingly persuasive. Philosophy professors assigned it in classes. Social critics debated its points. But for the FBI, the manifesto was something else. It was a map to the bomber's identity. The writing style, the vocabulary, the specific philosophical references, everything pointed to someone with advanced education, probably in mathematics or science. And somewhere in Illinois, a woman read the manifesto and felt a chill run down her spine. Because she recognized those words, that style of argument, those specific phrases. She recognized her brother-in-law. David Kaczynski had been worried about his brother Ted for years. They had been close once, but Ted had become increasingly isolated, moving to a remote cabin in Montana, cutting off contact with the family, occasionally sending strange letters filled with diatribes against technology. When David's wife, Linda Patrick, read the Unabomber's manifesto, she noticed disturbing similarities to Ted's letters. The same criticisms of technology, the same unusual sentence constructions, even the same specific misspellings. David didn't want to believe it. This was his brother, the child prodigy who had entered Harvard at 16, who had earned a PhD in mathematics from Michigan, who once had a brilliant future as an academic. How could he become a killer? But the more he compared the writings, the more terrible certainty grew. He hired a private investigator, Susan Swanson, to track down Ted's old letters. She confirmed his worst fears. The writing style matched. The vocabulary matched. Even the specific errors matched. David faced the most difficult decision of his life. He could remain silent, protect his brother, and potentially allow more people to die. Or he could betray his own blood, turn Ted over to the authorities, and live with that guilt for the rest of his life. He spent months agonizing. He consulted with philosophers, therapists, spiritual counselors. Finally, guided by his wife and his conscience, he made his decision. On February 15, 1996, David's attorney contacted the FBI. They had a suspect, Theodore John Kaczynski, living in a one-room cabin near Lincoln, Montana. April 3, 1996. FBI agents surrounded the small cabin in the Montana woods. It was primitive, no electricity, no running water, no modern heating. Just a man living as people had lived centuries before, rejecting exactly the technologies his manifesto had condemned. When agents knocked on the door, a 53-year-old man with a gray beard answered. He was thin, weathered by years of wilderness living, his intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He looked more like a hermit than a mathematical genius turned terrorist. "Theodore Kaczynski?" an agent asked. "Yes," he answered quietly. "We need you to come with us." He didn't resist. He just stood there, looking at the agents with what seemed like curiosity rather than fear, as if this moment, this capture, was just another interesting variable in some larger equation. When investigators searched the cabin, they found exactly what they needed. Meticulous journals documenting each bombing, drafts of the manifesto, bomb components, even a live bomb, fully assembled and ready to be sent. They found writings that revealed 17 years of careful planning, lists of potential targets, notes on how to improve bomb design, observations about what types of packages people were most likely to open, and they found Kaczynski's own words explaining his campaign. "By sending bombs to people, I'm not trying to kill as many as possible. If that were my goal, I could do more damage using indiscriminate terrorism. I don't do that because it would kill innocent people." In Ted Kaczynski's twisted mind, he had been being selective. He had been being moral. Theodore John Kaczynski was born on May 22, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. From an early age, he showed extraordinary intelligence. At 5, he could solve complex mathematical equations. At 10, he was reading advanced philosophy. His parents, proud of their prodigy son, pushed him academically. He skipped grades, always being the youngest, the smallest, the smartest in any room. He had few friends. He felt alienated, isolated, unable to connect with peers who couldn't keep up with his brilliance. At 16, he entered Harvard. But Harvard in the 1950s was where something fundamentally changed in Ted Kaczynski. He participated in a psychological experiment run by Dr. Henry Murray, a study funded by the CIA exploring interrogation techniques. For 3 years, Kaczynski was subjected to what can only be described as psychological abuse. He was made to write detailed essays about his deepest beliefs and values. Then he was strapped to a chair, hooked up to physiological monitors, and brutally ridiculed as his own words were read back to him with contempt. The experiments were designed to destroy the ego, to completely demoralize the subject. And for the young and already fragile Ted Kaczynski, they worked. Something broke in him during those years at Harvard, something that would never completely heal. He graduated in 1962, earned his PhD in mathematics from Michigan in 1967, and became an assistant professor at UC Berkeley, the youngest academic in the department's history. but he was already coming apart at the edges. In 1969, he abruptly resigned. What had happened in those 2 years at Berkeley? Kaczynski would never fully explain, but it's clear something pushed him over the edge. He retreated to Montana, built his cabin, and began his transformation from brilliant mathematician to domestic terrorist. Theodore Kaczynski's trial began on January 22, 1998, in the Eastern District of California in Sacramento. The case seemed simple. The evidence from the cabin irrefutably linked him to the bombings. But what unfolded was a battle over the narrative of who Ted Kaczynski really was. Prosecutors painted him as a cold, calculating killer who had methodically orchestrated 17 years of terror. They presented the bombs, the journals, the manifesto. They brought surviving victims to testify about how the attacks had shattered their lives. David Kaczynski testified, openly weeping as he described the agonizing decision to turn in his brother. "I love my brother," he said, "but I couldn't allow more people to die." The defense team wanted to argue insanity, that Kaczynski was a paranoid schizophrenic incapable of understanding the nature of his actions. Psychiatrists testified that he showed signs of severe mental illness, that his isolation and obsession with technology were symptoms of psychosis. But Kaczynski furiously rejected this defense. He didn't want to be portrayed as insane. He believed his actions were rational, justified, necessary. His manifesto wasn't the rambling of a sick man. It was a reasoned philosophical critique of industrial society. The conflict between Kaczynski and his own lawyers became so severe that he requested to represent himself. Judge Garland Burrell Jr. denied the request, finding Kaczynski competent to stand trial but too mentally unstable to effectively handle his own defense. Facing the prospect of being portrayed as insane against his will, Kaczynski made a decision. On January 22, 1998, he pleaded guilty to all charges in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no trial, no dramatic testimony, just a brilliant man accepting that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Theodore Kaczynski was sent to ADX Florence in Colorado, the most secure supermax prison in the United States. He would spend 23 hours a day in isolation, in a 7 by 12-foot concrete cell. But even in prison, Kaczynski refused to be silenced. He continued writing essays, articles, letters to academics and journalists. His work was published in academic journals. Professors assigned his writings in philosophy and environmental ethics courses. He corresponded with thousands of people around the world. Some were admirers who saw his bombs as regrettable but his ideas as profound. Others were academics genuinely interested in his philosophical arguments. Some were simply curious about the mind of a genius-turned-killer. His letters revealed a man without remorse. He defended his actions as necessary, though he admitted there were probably better ways to spread his message. He never apologized to the victims. He never expressed genuine regret. In 2016, he donated his personal papers and artifacts to the University of Michigan, including drafts of the manifesto and bomb components, with the condition that they not be displayed as curiosities but studied seriously as historical documents. His lawyers continued to contact him regularly, concerned about his mental well-being. Kaczynski consistently dismissed them, insisting he was perfectly sane, perfectly rational, perfectly justified in everything he had done. And outside, his legacy grew in ways he could never have anticipated. Kaczynski's manifesto never disappeared. Despite efforts to marginalize his ideas as the writings of a terrorist, industrial society and its future found audiences in surprising places. Radical environmentalists cited his criticisms of industrial civilization. Anarcho-primitivists adopted his calls to dismantle modern technology. Even Silicon Valley executives privately admitted that some of his observations about technology's unintended consequences were disturbingly accurate. Philosophers like John Zerzan expanded on Kaczynski's themes, arguing for a return to pre-agricultural ways of life. The collapse movement, people preparing for the eventual collapse of industrial civilization, cited the manifesto as a foundational text. But there were also darker consequences. Multiple domestic terrorists cited Kaczynski as inspiration. In 2011, Anders Breivik, who killed 77 people in Norway, included large sections of the manifesto in his own treatise. Eco-terrorists justified violence using Kaczynski's arguments. The FBI monitored these developments closely. Kaczynski's legacy wasn't just academic. It was actively inspiring a new generation of extremists. Scholars debated how to deal with his work. Could the ideas be separated from the terrorist who wrote them? Did the manifesto contain legitimate truths about technology and freedom, or was it all tainted by the violence that delivered it to the world? Philosophy professor David Skrbina argued that Kaczynski's bombs were completely unjustified, but that his philosophical arguments deserved serious consideration. Others insisted that giving Kaczynski any intellectual credibility was dangerous, validating his violent methods. The truth, as always, was complicated. Amid all the philosophical debates and intellectual analysis, it's easy to forget the human cost of Ted Kaczynski's campaign. 3 people dead, 23 injured, countless families shattered. Hugh Scruton, 38 years old, computer store owner, killed instantly in 1985. He left behind a mother, siblings, friends who would never understand why his life was taken for an ideology he rejected. Thomas Mosser, 50 years old, advertising executive, murdered in 1994 when a bomb exploded in his New Jersey home kitchen. His wife and daughters were home. They heard the explosion, ran downstairs, found their husband and father dying on the floor. Gilbert Murray, 47 years old, forestry executive, killed in 1995. Behind a mother, siblings, friends who would never understand why his life was taken for an ideology he rejected. Thomas Mosser, 50 years old, advertising executive, murdered in 1994 when a bomb exploded in his New Jersey home kitchen. His wife and daughters were home. They heard the explosion, ran downstairs, found their husband and father dying on the floor. Gilbert Murray, 47 years old, forestry executive, killed in 1995. He had dedicated his career to sustainable forest management, not exactly the environmental villain Kaczynski's manifesto described. But he was murdered anyway, his life reduced to a symbol in one man's war against technology. And then there were the survivors. Dr. David Gelernter, who lost sight in one eye and use of his right hand. Diana Maples, a secretary who opened a package meant for her boss and was severely injured. Gary Wright, injured so severely he could never work again. These people weren't abstract enemies of nature. They were humans, complex, imperfect, trying to live their lives. And Ted Kaczynski had judged them worthy of death without ever knowing them. Kaczynski's brother, David, spent years trying to bring some kind of closure to the victims' families. He donated the $1 million FBI reward directly to them. He wrote letters of apology. He met with survivors, listening to their stories, carrying the weight of what his brother had done. "I can't undo what Ted did," he told a journalist, "but I can spend the rest of my life trying to honor the people he hurt." On June 10, 2023, Theodore Kaczynski was found dead in his cell at the Federal Medical Center in North Carolina. He was 81 years old. Prison authorities said he had apparently committed suicide. He had spent 25 years in prison, never showing remorse, never retracting his ideas, never apologizing to the victims. He died as he had lived, defiant, isolated, convinced that history would eventually prove him right. Reactions to his death were mixed. Some celebrated the end of a killer, relieved he could never again inspire violence. Others pointed to the tragedy of a genius so brilliant who took such a dark path. Philosophers and sociologists wrote complicated obituaries, struggling with how to remember a man whose ideas influenced their field but whose actions were unforgivable. Was Ted Kaczynski a visionary who saw technology's dystopian future before others? Or was he simply a killer who rationalized his violence with philosophy? The victims and their families had simpler reactions. "Good," one survivor said. "I hoped he would live longer in prison, that he would suffer more. But at least he's gone." David Kaczynski issued a statement. "Ted was my brother, and a part of me will always love him. But he was also responsible for tremendous suffering. My hope is that his death allows the victims and their families some measure of peace. The cabin where Kaczynski had lived and planned his attacks now stands in the Newseum in Washington, D.C. Thousands of visitors pass by it each year, staring at the primitive living space, trying to understand how a mathematical genius became the Unabomber. So what does Ted Kaczynski's story leave us with? More than 2 decades after his capture, years after his death, his ideas still resonate in ways that make many people uncomfortable. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Some of his predictions have come true. Technology has eroded privacy in ways he described. Social media has created exactly the kind of social control he warned about. Artificial intelligence poses existential threats that align disturbingly with his warnings. That doesn't make his bombs justified. That doesn't make his murders justified. But it makes his ideas impossible to completely dismiss. The lesson of Ted Kaczynski isn't that he was right about technology. It's that brilliance isn't wisdom, that intelligence without empathy is dangerous, that ideas, no matter how intellectually rigorous, can never justify violence against the innocent. He was a man who could have changed the world through his mathematics, his teaching, his writing. Instead, he chose terror. He chose murder. And in doing so, he forever tainted whatever legitimate ideas he might have had. As you drift off to sleep tonight, listening to the rain, remember the names of those who lost their lives. Hugh Scruton, Thomas Mosser, Gilbert Murray. Remember those who were injured, David Galerner, Gary Wright, Diana Maples, and so many others. They were real people with families and dreams and futures that were stolen by a man who valued his ideas more than their lives. The cabin in Montana stands empty now, a monument to madness and genius, to isolation and rage. The manifesto still circulates, still read, still debated. And somewhere, other lonely ones, other brilliant but broken people, read his words and wonder if he was right. The answer is no. He never was. Because no matter how profound your ideas, no matter how brilliant your mind, nothing, absolutely nothing, justifies taking another human being's life. That is Theodore Kaczynski's true legacy. Not his ideas about technology, but the reminder that brilliance without humanity is the most dangerous form of madness. October 16th, 1984. The Valognes River flows through the Vosges region of northeastern France. Its waters cold and dark even in autumn. It's a peaceful place, where families come to fish and children play along the banks. But on this particular evening, the river would reveal something that would tear apart not just one family, but an entire nation. At 9:15 p.m., fishermen spotted something in the water near the village of Lapangis-sur-Valognes. At first, they thought it was a doll, a child's toy caught in the current. But as they moved closer, the horrible truth became clear. It was a body, a small body, a child. 4-year-old Gregory Villemin had been found, his hands and feet bound with rope. His small frame dressed in the clothing he'd been wearing when he disappeared from his family's front yard just hours earlier. He had been drowned, deliberately and methodically, his tiny body thrown into the river like garbage. The fishermen called the police, their voices shaking. By the time investigators arrived, a crowd had gathered along the riverbank. News traveled fast in these small villages, and everyone knew the Villemin family. Everyone knew little Gregory with his bright smile and curious eyes. But what no one knew, what no one could have possibly imagined, was that this was just the beginning of a mystery that would consume France for decades. A mystery so twisted, so full of lies and accusations and destroyed lives, that it would become known simply as L'Affaire Gregory. And 40 years later, we still don't know who killed him. Before we dive deeper into this heartbreaking case, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? Are you in Paris, Mexico City, Montreal, or somewhere else in the world? Drop your location in the comments below. I love seeing where this community reaches across the globe and knowing we're all here together, exploring these stories in the quiet hours. And if this is your first time here, welcome. This channel is dedicated to telling true crime stories the way they deserve to be told, with respect for the victims, attention to detail, and an unflinching look at the truth. We don't sensationalize. We don't exploit. We simply tell the story. If you appreciate that approach, Please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And if you're already part of this family, thank you. Your support means everything. A like on this video and sharing it with someone who appreciates well-researched true crime helps us continue doing this work. Now, let's go back to that terrible night in October 1984. Because what happened to Gregory Villemin wasn't random. It wasn't a stranger abduction gone wrong. The truth was far more sinister than that. Someone had been tormenting the Villemin family for years. Someone close to them. Someone who knew their every move, their schedules, their vulnerabilities. Someone who had finally decided that psychological torture wasn't enough. They wanted blood. Jean-Marie and Christine Villemin were a young couple trying to build a good life in the Vosges region. Jean-Marie worked as a supervisor at a local factory, a position that paid well and gave him some status in the working class community. Christine stayed home with their son Gregory, a happy, energetic 4-year-old who was the light of their lives. On the surface, they seemed to have everything. A nice home, steady income, a beautiful child. But beneath that surface, tensions simmered. Jean-Marie had done better than many in his extended family. He'd climbed higher, earned more, achieved what others hadn't. And in small French villages where everyone knows everyone's business, success can breed resentment. The Villemin family was large and complicated, full of cousins and uncles and distant relatives, all interconnected through generations of living in the same small towns. Some were happy for Jean-Marie's success. Others were bitter, jealous, feeling left behind. And one of them, someone in that tangled web of family connections, had started making phone calls. The calls began in 1983, more than a year before Gregory's death. A man's voice, disguised but familiar somehow, would call the Villemin home and taunt Jean-Marie. "I'm going to make you pay," the voice would say. "You think you're better than everyone else. I'm going to take everything from you." The calls were cruel, calculated, designed to create fear and paranoia. Sometimes the caller would describe Jean-Marie's movements, where he'd been that day, what he'd been wearing. It was clear this person was watching them, stalking them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jean-Marie reported the calls to police. They did nothing. In their minds, it was probably just family drama, nothing serious. After all, who would actually hurt a child over family jealousy? They would soon learn the answer to that question. October 16, 1984 started as an ordinary day. Christine Villemin was home with Gregory, doing laundry and household chores. Jean-Marie was at work at the factory. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable in every way. Around 5 p.m., Christine went inside to hang some laundry. Gregory was playing in the front yard, as he often did. The yard was enclosed, safe, visible from the house. Christine would check on him every few minutes through the window. It was a routine they'd done countless times. But when she looked out around 5:30 p.m., Gregory was gone. Christine ran outside, calling his name. The yard was empty. The gate was open. Panic seized her as she searched the street, the neighbors' yards, calling for her son over and over. She phoned Jean-Marie at the factory, her voice breaking. "Gregory is gone. Someone took him." Jean-Marie rushed home. They called the police, who began searching immediately. The entire village mobilized. Neighbors, family members, strangers all combing the area for any sign of the little boy with dark hair and bright eyes. At 6:30 p.m., Jean-Marie received a phone call at home. It was the voice, the same disguised voice that had been tormenting him for over a year. "I took the boy," the voice said, calm and almost gleeful. "Go look in the Valone." Jean-Marie's blood turned to ice. He knew what that meant. The Valone River was where people dumped things they wanted to disappear. And now, according to this monster, that's where his son was. The police rushed to the river, and at 9:15 p.m., they found exactly what the caller had promised. The sight that greeted investigators along the Valone was one that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Little Gregory Villemin, just 4 years old, lay in the shallow water. His hands had been bound behind his back with white rope. His feet were tied together. A woolen hat was pulled down over his face. The medical examiner determined that Gregory had been alive when he entered the water. He had drowned, struggling against his bonds, unable to save himself. The cruelty was unfathomable. Whoever had done this hadn't just killed a child. They had made sure he suffered. But there was something else, something that would become crucial to the investigation. Gregory's body showed no signs of a struggle before the drowning. No bruises from being grabbed or carried against his will. No defensive wounds. It was as if he had gone willingly with whoever took him, trusting them completely. That meant one terrible thing. Gregory knew his killer. The crime scene yielded few clues. Some tire tracks near where the body was found, but they were common treads that could have come from thousands of vehicles. Fibers on Gregory's clothing, but without a suspect, they were meaningless. The white rope binding his hands and feet, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. What investigators did have was the phone call. Jean-Marie had received dozens of threatening calls over the past year, and while police had dismissed them as pranks, now they took on new significance. The caller had promised to take everything from Jean-Marie, and he had started by taking what mattered most. But who was the caller? Who hated the Villemins enough to murder an innocent child? The answer, investigators believed, lay somewhere in the tangled web of the Villemin family tree. The phone calls were just one part of the torment. There were also letters, anonymous, cruel, taunting letters that had been arriving at the Villemin home for months. The writer signed them Le Corbeau, the Crow. In French culture, a corbeau is someone who sends anonymous poison pen letters, spreading malicious gossip and accusations. And this particular crow seemed to know everything about the Villemin family's private life. The letters were filled with intimate details about Jean-Marie and Christine's daily routines, their finances, their relationships with other family members. The crow knew when Jean-Marie got a raise at work. He knew when Christine went to visit her parents. He knew what car they drove and where they parked it. "You think you're so much better than everyone else," one letter read. "You parade around with your nice house and your good job, looking down on the rest of us. But I'm going to bring you down. I'm going to make you suffer like you've made others suffer." The accusations made no sense to Jean-Marie and Christine. They hadn't done anything to hurt anyone. They were just trying to live their lives, raise their son, be happy. But clearly, someone saw it differently. Someone believed they had been wronged. After Gregory's death, the letters continued. But now they were triumphant, gloating. "I hope you're suffering," one letter said. "I wanted you to know what it feels like to lose everything. Your son is dead because of you, because you thought you were better than everyone else." Handwriting experts studied the letters. The writing was disguised, sometimes printed in block letters, sometimes in an awkward cursive that seemed deliberately altered. But there were patterns, quirks, certain phrases that appeared repeatedly. The police believed they could identify the crow if they could just get writing samples from the right person. The question was, who should they be looking at? The investigation quickly focused on the extended Villemin family. Jean-Marie had several cousins, uncles, and relatives who lived in the surrounding villages. Many of them worked in the same factory. Many of them had known each other their entire lives. And many of them, police discovered, harbored deep resentments toward Jean-Marie. One name kept coming up in interviews: Bernard Laroche, Jean-Marie's cousin. Laroche was 29 years old, married with a young daughter. He worked in a factory but earned less than Jean-Marie. He lived in a smaller house. He had, by all accounts, achieved less in life. More importantly, Laroche had been seen in the area around the Villemin home on the day of Gregory's disappearance. Multiple witnesses reported seeing his car, a Peugeot 305, near the village that afternoon. When police questioned him, Laroche was defensive and evasive. He claimed he'd been at work all day, but his alibi had gaps. He couldn't account for his whereabouts during the crucial hours between 5 o'clock and 6 p.m. Then came the breakthrough. Laroche's sister-in-law, Muriel Ball, was just 15 years old. She worked as a babysitter and knew both families well. When police questioned her on October 29, 1984, less than 2 weeks after Gregory's death, she broke down and confessed. She had been with Bernard Laroche the afternoon of October 16th. She had watched as he approached little Gregory in the yard. She had seen Gregory go with him willingly. He knew his cousin, trusted him. She had been in the car when Laroche drove to the river. She had heard the splash when Gregory's body hit the water. It was the confession police needed. On November 5, 1984, Bernard Laroche was arrested for the murder of Gregory Villemin. The case seemed solved. Justice, it appeared, would be served. But this was France. And in France, nothing is ever that simple. Within days of her confession, Muriel Ball recanted everything. She claimed police had coerced her, pressured her, manipulated a frightened teenage girl into saying what they wanted to hear. She said she'd never been in Bernard Laroche's car that day. She'd never seen him take Gregory. She'd made it all up because the interrogators told her she'd go to prison if she didn't cooperate. The retraction threw the case into chaos. Without Muriel's testimony, the evidence against Bernard Laroche was entirely circumstantial. The tire tracks could have been from any car. The witness sightings were uncertain. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Laroche's lawyers argued that he was being scapegoated, that police had rushed to judgment because they needed someone to blame. They pointed out that dozens of people in the extended family had potential motives. Why focus solely on Bernard? Judge Jean-Michel Lambert, who was overseeing the investigation, faced enormous pressure. The entire nation was watching this case. The media had descended on the small Vosges villages, turning the tragedy into a spectacle. Everyone had an opinion about who killed Gregory, and those opinions were loud and divisive. Lambert made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. On February 4, 1985, less than 4 months after Gregory's death, he ordered Bernard Laroche released from custody due to insufficient evidence. The news hit Jean-Marie Villemin like a physical blow. The man he believed had murdered his son was walking free. The justice system had failed him. The police had failed him. Everyone had failed him. And Jean-Marie Villemin was not the kind of man to accept failure quietly. March 29, 1985. Bernard Laroche was working on his car outside his home when Jean-Marie Villemin pulled up. The two men had been cousins once, had grown up together, had shared family meals and celebrations. Now they were enemies, connected by the death of a child and accusations that had poisoned everything. Jean-Marie stepped out of his car. In his hand was a shotgun. "This is for Gregory," he said, and then he fired. Bernard Laroche died instantly, shot in the chest at close range. He was 29 years old, the same age as Jean-Marie. He left behind a wife and a young daughter. And he went to his grave either as the murderer of Gregory Villemin or as the innocent victim of a grieving father's rage, depending on who you believed. Jean-Marie was arrested immediately. He didn't resist, didn't try to flee. He had done what he set out to do. In his mind, he had delivered the justice that the courts had denied him. The murder of Bernard Laroche divided France even further. Some saw Jean-Marie as a tragic hero, a father driven to desperate action by an unbearable loss and a failed justice system. Others saw him as a vigilante killer who had murdered an innocent man based on a retracted confession from a scared teenager. The question everyone was asking was the same one that had haunted the case from the beginning. Did Bernard Laroche kill Gregory Villemin? And now, with Laroche dead, would they ever know the truth? While Jean-Marie awaited trial for Bernard Laroche's murder, investigators continued working on the original case. The anonymous letters from the Crow kept coming, which proved one thing. If Bernard Laroche had been the Crow, someone was continuing his work. Or perhaps Laroche had never been the Crow at all. Handwriting experts analyzed the letters obsessively. They compared them to writing samples from dozens of family members, neighbors, anyone who might have had contact with the Villemins. The analysis was complicated by the fact that the Crow seemed to deliberately disguise their handwriting, sometimes using their non-dominant hand, sometimes printing, sometimes using unusual letter formations. But in 1985, experts made a shocking announcement. After extensive analysis, they believed the Crow's handwriting matched someone very close to the case. Someone no one had seriously considered as a suspect. Christine Villemin. Gregory's mother. The accusation was almost incomprehensible. How could a mother write threatening letters to herself? How could she participate in the psychological torture of her own family? And most horrifically, could she have killed her own son? The theory prosecutors developed was disturbing. They suggested that Christine had been suffering from severe postpartum depression or mental illness, that she had created the character of the Crow to torment her husband, perhaps out of resentment for his success or attention, that the situation had spiraled out of control, leading to a moment of madness where she had killed Gregory. The evidence was circumstantial but troubling. Christine had been alone with Gregory when he disappeared. She had no solid alibi for the critical minutes when he was taken, and according to handwriting experts, certain quirks in the Crow's letters matched her writing style. On July 5, 1985, just 3 months after Jean-Marie killed Bernard Laroche, Christine Villemin was arrested and charged with the murder of her son. France watched in horror as a grieving mother was led away in handcuffs, accused of the unthinkable. The arrest of Christine Villemin created a media firestorm unlike anything France had seen before. The case was already national news, but now it became an obsession. Newspapers ran daily updates. Television programs debated the evidence. Everyone had a theory about what really happened. Some believed Christine was guilty. They pointed to the handwriting analysis, to the fact that she was the last person to see Gregory alive, to what they saw as suspicious behavior in the days after his death. "No mother grieves that way," they said, analyzing her every tear, every expression, every word in interviews. Others believed she was being scapegoated by a justice system desperate to close the case. They pointed out that handwriting analysis was far from an exact science, that grief manifests in different ways, that there was absolutely no physical evidence linking Christine to the crime. They couldn't convict the man, so now they're going after the mother, they argued. Jean-Marie Villemin stood by his wife completely. Even as he sat in prison awaiting his own trial for killing Bernard Laroche, he insisted that Christine was innocent, that she loved Gregory more than life itself, that she would never have harmed him. Christine spent months in prison before a judge finally released her on February 13, 1986, citing insufficient evidence. The handwriting analysis that had been so certain was now questioned by other experts. Without concrete proof, they couldn't hold her. But the damage was done. Christine Villemin had been publicly accused of murdering her own child. Her name, her reputation, her entire life had been destroyed. Even after her release, people whispered, they pointed, they judged, and the real killer, whoever they were, remained free. Jean-Marie Villemin's trial for the murder of Bernard Laroche began in 1993, 8 years after the killing. The delay had been caused by the complexity of the Gregory case, by multiple investigations and reinvestigations, by the French legal system grinding slowly through one of its most controversial cases. The trial lasted just 3 days. Jean-Marie didn't deny killing Laroche. His defense was simple: temporary insanity brought on by unbearable grief and the failure of the justice system to protect his family. "I am not a murderer," Jean-Marie told the court. "I am a father who lost everything. I watched as my son's killer was released, free to live his life while my son lay in a grave. I did what any father would do. I did what I had to do." The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, their verdict shocked many. Not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. Jean-Marie was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but the sentence was suspended. He walked free, having served time while awaiting trial. The verdict was seen as validation by some, proof that the justice system recognized the impossibility of Jean-Marie's situation. Others saw it as a travesty, a man getting away with murder because the victim was unpopular. But there was one problem with Jean-Marie's acquittal. If Bernard Laroche was innocent, as the verdict implied, then who killed Gregory? The investigation continued, on and off, for decades. New judges took over the case. New evidence was analyzed. DNA testing became available, offering possibilities that didn't exist in 1984. But every lead seemed to go nowhere. Every theory collapsed under scrutiny. The Crow continued to send letters occasionally, taunting investigators, claiming responsibility, offering cryptic clues that led nowhere. The letters would stop for years, then resume. The handwriting would change. The theories would multiply, and Gregory's killer remained in the shadows, unnamed and unpunished. As years passed and the case remained unsolved, attention returned to Muriel Ball, the teenage girl whose confession and retraction had shaped the early investigation. Who was she really? Why had she confessed? And most importantly, had she been telling the truth the first time? Muriel, now an adult, maintained that her confession was coerced. She insisted she had been pressured by police, that she'd been scared and confused, that she'd said what they wanted to hear. But investigators noted troubling inconsistencies in her retractions. Details kept changing. The story evolved with each telling. In 2000, Muriel gave a televised interview where she stood by her retraction but admitted she might have seen something that day. It was a strange middle ground, not quite confession, not quite denial, as if the truth was too dangerous to speak aloud. Her brother, Jean-Marie Ball, became convinced that the key to the Gregory case lay within their own family. He believed that Muriel knew more than she was saying, that she was protecting someone. But who and why? The Ball family, like the Willemins, became fractured by the case. Siblings stopped speaking. Parents took sides. Marriages ended. The poison that had infected the Willemins spread to everyone touched by the investigation. In 2013, nearly 30 years after Gregory's death, investigators made a decision. They would reinterrogate Muriel Ball, using modern techniques, trying to finally get to the truth of what she knew. Muriel was arrested and held for questioning. For days, she maintained her innocence. Then, after intense interrogation, she confessed again. She had been with Bernard Laroche. She had seen him take Gregory. She had been in the car. But days later, she retracted again. She claimed, once more, that police had coerced her, pressured her, manipulated her. It was 1984 all over again, and investigators were no closer to the truth. By 2017, DNA technology had advanced far beyond what was available in 1984. Investigators decided to re-examine all the physical evidence from Gregory's case using modern forensic techniques. Perhaps microscopic traces of DNA could finally identify the killer. They tested the rope that had bound Gregory's hands and feet. They tested his clothing. They tested samples taken from his body during the autopsy. And they found something: DNA profiles that didn't match Gregory, his parents, or Bernard Laroche. Unknown DNA that could belong to the killer, or to anyone who had innocently come into contact with the evidence over 3 decades. But one profile was particularly interesting. DNA found on Gregory's clothing matched someone in the extended family. Not Bernard Laroche, someone else. Someone who had always been on the periphery of the investigation but never seriously considered as a suspect. On June 15, 2017, police arrested Marcel Jacob, Bernard Laroche's brother-in-law, along with his wife Jacqueline. They also arrested Marcel's wife's sister and her husband. For people all connected to Bernard Laroche, all part of the extended family network. The theory was that this had been a conspiracy, multiple people working together to torment the Willemins and ultimately kill Gregory. The DNA, while not conclusive, suggested that Marcel Jacob might have been involved. France erupted with renewed interest in the case. After 33 years, was justice finally at hand? Would Gregory's killer or killers finally be identified? The arrests made headlines around the world. The Gregory affair, which had haunted France for over 3 decades, seemed poised for resolution. But once again, the French justice system had other plans. The case against Marcel Jacob and the others quickly began to fall apart. The DNA evidence that seemed so promising was actually far more ambiguous than initial reports suggested. The samples were degraded after decades of storage. The matches were partial, not definitive, and there were innocent explanations for how the DNA could have gotten there. Marcel Jacob had been at the Willemin home occasionally for family gatherings. He could have touched Gregory innocently. The DNA proved contact, but not murder. More problematically, There was no other evidence connecting any of the arrested individuals to the crime. No witnesses, no confessions, no physical evidence beyond the ambiguous DNA. The entire case rested on the theory that they must have been involved because they were related to Bernard Laroche. On December 13, 2017, just 6 months after their arrests, all 4 suspects were released. The investigating judge, who had been so confident in the DNA evidence, was forced to admit there wasn't enough to proceed to trial. The Villemin family was devastated. Once again, they had been given hope that justice might finally be served. Once again, that hope was crushed. Jean-Marie, now in his 60s, told reporters he had lost faith in the French justice system entirely. "They've been investigating my son's murder for 33 years, he said. "And they're no closer to the truth than they were on the first day. How is that possible?" Christine, who had lived for decades under the shadow of suspicion, was bitter. "They accused me of killing my own child," she said. "They arrested me, imprisoned me, destroyed my life. And for what? They still don't know who killed Gregory. They probably never will." The latest failure reignited all the old debates. Who killed Gregory Villemin? Was it Bernard Laroche, as the original confession suggested? Was it a conspiracy involving his relatives? Was it someone else entirely, someone investigators had never even considered? Or, and this was the theory that refused to die, could it have been Christine after all? The Gregory affair became a national obsession in France, spawning countless books, documentaries, and true crime analyses. Amateur detectives pored over every detail of the case, developing elaborate theories about what really happened. Some believed the key was in the anonymous letters. They analyzed every word, every phrase, looking for clues about the writer's identity, education level, psychological state. They created databases of vocabulary and syntax, comparing them to letters written by various suspects. Others focused on the timeline. They mapped out every minute of October 16, 1984, trying to identify gaps in alibis, opportunities for the crime to be committed. They studied weather reports, traffic patterns, anything that might reveal the truth. Online forums dedicated to the case attracted thousands of members. They debated endlessly, Laroche or no Laroche, Christine or not Christine, conspiracy or lone killer. The discussions were often heated, sometimes vicious, always passionate. One amateur investigator noticed something that police had missed. The Crow's letters contained specific details about Jean-Marie's work at the factory, details that only someone who worked there would know. This led to new theories about coworkers who might have harbored grudges. Another researcher focused on the rope used to bind Gregory. It was a specific type sold at only certain stores. By tracking sales records from 1984, they tried to identify possible buyers. The work was meticulous, exhaustive, and ultimately inconclusive. The problem with the Gregory case was that there were too many theories, too many suspects, too many possible explanations. Evidence could be interpreted multiple ways. Every answer led to more questions. The truth, if it existed, was buried under decades of investigation, speculation, and conflicting narratives. And the killer, whoever they were, had been smart enough or lucky enough to stay hidden for nearly 40 years. The Gregory affair didn't just destroy the Villemin family. It poisoned an entire region of France, turning neighbors against each other, creating suspicions that lasted generations. In the small villages of the Vosges, people stopped talking to each other. Families who had lived side by side for decades became enemies. Everyone suspected everyone else. The social fabric of these communities was torn apart by accusations, counter-accusations, and the constant scrutiny of investigators and media. Judge Jean-Michel Lambert, who had released Bernard Laroche in 1985, became a target of public rage. He was criticized mercilessly in the media, accused of incompetence, blamed for Jean-Marie's vigilante killing. The pressure destroyed him. He lost his position, his reputation, his career. In July 2017, shortly after the new arrests in the case, Lambert committed suicide. He left no note, but those who knew him said the Gregory case had haunted him until the end. Muriel Ball's life was shattered by her involvement. Her confession and retraction made her a controversial figure, suspected by some of complicity, pitted by others as a victim of police coercion. She struggled with mental health issues, changed her name, tried to disappear from public view. But the case followed her. It always followed her. Bernard Laroche's widow and daughter lived under constant suspicion. Even though Laroche was killed before he could be tried, many people believed he was guilty. His family members were shunned, treated as accomplices to murder. They moved away, changed their names, tried to escape the shadow of the Gregory affair. And Jean-Marie and Christine Villemin lived in their own private hell. They had lost their son. They had been accused of his murder. They had watched as the justice system failed them repeatedly. They had aged decades in just a few years, their faces showing the weight of unimaginable grief and betrayal. In 2000, Christine gave birth to another child, a son they named Julian. It was an attempt to move forward, to find some joy in life again. But Gregory's ghost was always there, hovering over everything they did. The French media's coverage of the Gregory affair was unprecedented and controversial. From the moment Gregory's body was discovered, journalists descended on the Vosges like vultures, turning a family tragedy into a national spectacle. Television cameras captured Jean-Marie and Christine at their most vulnerable moments. Newspapers published leaked details from the investigation, often getting facts wrong, always prioritizing sensationalism over accuracy. The family's private grief became public entertainment. The coverage was particularly brutal toward Christine. Every tear was analyzed. Every expression was scrutinized. Magazine covers showed her face alongside headlines like, "Did she kill her own son?" The presumption of innocence meant nothing in the court of public opinion. When Jean-Marie killed Bernard Laroche, the media coverage reached a fever pitch. Some outlets lionized him as a tragic hero. Others condemned him as a murderer. The nuance of his situation. A grieving father driven to desperation by a failed justice system was lost in the rush for clicks and ratings. The Gregory case helped establish the modern French true crime genre. It showed that real-life tragedy could be packaged and sold as entertainment. It created a template that would be followed by countless cases in the decades to come. But at what cost? The Villemin family, who deserved privacy and respect in their grief, instead became characters in a national drama. Every development in the case was dissected on talk shows. Every theory was debated in newspapers. Their pain was commodified, their tragedy monetized. And through it all, the real story, the death of an innocent 4-year-old boy, was often lost in the noise. As of 2024, 40 years after Gregory Villemin's death, the case remains officially unsolved. The investigation is technically still open, though active work has slowed significantly in recent years. In 2020, investigators announced they were pursuing new leads based on additional DNA analysis. They declined to provide details, saying only that the investigation was progressing. But the Villemin family has heard promises like this before. They've learned not to get their hopes up. The most recent theory gaining traction among investigators is that multiple people were involved, not necessarily in the killing itself, but in the campaign of harassment that preceded it. Perhaps one person was the crow sending letters and making calls. Perhaps another person, driven to action by the ongoing psychological torture, killed Gregory in a moment of madness. This theory would explain why the case has been so difficult to solve. It's not one killer with one motive, but a web of resentments and actions that spiraled out of control. But theories are all anyone has. Without a confession or definitive physical evidence, the truth remains elusive. Bernard Laroche is dead, killed before he could be tried. Muriel Ball has confessed and retracted so many times that her testimony is worthless. The DNA evidence is ambiguous. The handwriting analysis is disputed. The witness statements are contradictory. Everything about the Gregory affair is messy, complicated, frustrating. It's a case that seems designed to resist solution, to generate more questions than answers. Jean-Marie and Christine Villemin, now in their 60s, have largely withdrawn from public life. They rarely give interviews anymore. They've said everything there is to say. Now they simply wait, hoping that before they die, they'll learn who killed their son. But with each passing year, that hope grows dimmer. The Gregory affair changed France in ways that extend far beyond a single unsolved murder case. It revealed deep fissures in French society, between rural and urban, between working class and elite, between those who trust the justice system and those who see it as fundamentally broken. It showed how media coverage can transform a tragedy into a circus, how public opinion can convict without evidence, how the presumption of innocence can be destroyed by speculation and sensationalism. It demonstrated the limits of forensic science. DNA was supposed to solve cases like this. Modern investigative techniques were supposed to bring justice. But 40 years later, with all the advances in technology and methodology, investigators are no closer to identifying Gregory's killer than they were in 1984. The case has also become a cautionary tale about family dynamics and resentment. Whatever happened to Gregory Villemin, it grew out of poisonous relationships within an extended family. Jealousy, bitterness, unresolved conflicts. These things festered until they exploded into violence. For true crime enthusiasts around the world, the Gregory affair represents the perfect unsolved mystery. It has everything: an innocent victim, multiple suspects, conflicting evidence, dramatic twists, moral ambiguity. It's been the subject of documentaries on Netflix and other platforms, introducing new generations to the story. But for the people of the Vosges region, for the Villemin family, for everyone touched by this case, it's not entertainment. It's a wound that never healed, a question that never got answered, a ghost that never went away. As you drift off to sleep tonight, listening to the rain, think about little Gregory Villemin. 4 years old, with his whole life ahead of him. He trusted someone enough to go with them that October afternoon. He had no idea that trust would cost him everything. Think about his parents, who have lived for 40 years without justice, without closure, without peace. Who wake up every morning knowing their son's killer is still out there somewhere, unnamed and unpunished. Think about how fragile life is, how quickly happiness can be stolen, how easily families can be destroyed by hatred and resentment. The Valognes River still flows through the Vosges region, its waters cold and dark. Children still play along its banks, though parents watch them more carefully now. The villages are quieter than they used to be, haunted by memories of accusations and betrayals. And somewhere, in France or perhaps abroad, alive or perhaps dead, the person who killed Gregory Villemin carries their secret. They know what happened that day. They know the truth that has eluded investigators for 4 decades. Will they ever speak? Will the truth ever emerge? Or will the Gregory affair remain forever unsolved, France's most divisive mystery, a case that broke a family and divided a nation? Only time will tell. But for Jean-Marie and Christine Villemin, time is running out. And their son deserves better than eternal mystery. He deserves justice. He deserves the truth. He deserves to be remembered not as a famous victim, but as a little boy who loved to play, who trusted the wrong person, and who paid for that trust with his life.